The reading this morning, I'm going to follow it with a short period of silence, is also by Gordon, no, actually it's by Elizabeth Strong, who adapted it from Gordon McKeeman. Elizabeth Strong is again, Universalist from her lifetime. She wrote this: where the heart stirs, there moves Universalism. The center holds us with its transformational power of love. We know with a wholeness of spirit that God is love and life is good, that people are created for goodness out of love, that in the final reckoning all will be one. When we hurt, when we are broken, when we become separated, let us seek the center which holds. Let us remember the goodness for which we were created. Let us be open to the transformational power of love that moves in the heart of life and become whole once again. So I think what I'm going to do is read it a second time. Where the heart stirs, there moves Universalism. The center holds us within its transformational power of love. We know with a wholeness of spirit that God is love, that life is good, that people are created for goodness out of love, and that in the final reckoning all will be one. When we hurt, when we are broken, when we become separated, let us seek the center that holds. Let us remember the goodness for which we are created. Let us be open to the transformational power of love that moves in the heart of life, and may we be whole again. So why don't you reflect on those words for a few moments. We're running a tad early today, and I'm going to leave a little bit of time for some of your favorite things to do, which we don't do that much anymore, called conversation. So after the sermon is over, we'll have a little bit of time for that. But right now, just think about, what does it mean where the heart stirs, there moves Universalism? Just reflect on that. Well, thank you for being here on this cold, crisp, but sunny winter morning. Is Annalise here today? I guess not. I mentioned last week that Betsy had come up with the idea, with consultation, of this table at the end, over in the corner there, to light candles of joys of sorrows that you wanted to share, but privately, during the course of the service. And I'd forgotten totally that Annalise made the cloth that goes on that table. So I neglected that, and I want to correct that now. Also, as a couple of kind of quick announcements, the men's restroom is partly out of order out here, and Nate, in his supplemental job as search committee chairperson, also acted as janitor to get it cleared up. But the other available restroom for men and women both is over at the end of the hall. Additionally, I would remind you that in 2 weeks, I'm going to do a service that I did last year, which was actually kind of fun in a twisted way, and that was the Stump the Minister Sunday. The opportunity for you to write up any question or questions that you think might be interesting, send them to Julie at the office, or on the morning of that service, which is 2 weeks from today, give them to Gilman, who's here someplace out back in the corner, or Sherry, as co-chairs of the Sunday Services Committee. They will then come up here and they will read the questions. I will not see any of them in advance. I will then try to answer them. This is your great opportunity. All right. And yes, by the way, there is a mindful eating class today at 12 in Founder's House. All right. Now, the best laid plans of interim ministers sometimes don't work. This is one of those times. I had hoped that Bernice and Albert Holt would be here this morning, sitting here in front as they always do. The reason I was hoping they would be here is because I was going to acknowledge them as two unsung heroes of this congregation. They're here almost every Sunday. We have the same last name, but we're probably not related except about 10 generations ago back in the old country, whatever the old country was. But they're kin. They were passionate and are passionate speakers for justice and equity. They've been a blessing to you of this fellowship for many, many years. And they're among the generations that gave their sweat, passion, courage, and faith so you could be here. All those people who are your forebears really deserve a lot of thanks, and I don't think they get thanked enough. So just to confuse them, next Sunday or the Sunday after, come up to them and say, thank you. And they're going to probably go, what? And it'll be so much fun. But thank them for being here, and thank them for all the work that they did. So I just wanted to start with that, because their work really reminds me of what Universalism I think we should own. Now, again, for those of you who might be new, like from South Florida, Unitarian Universalism is a long name, and it doesn't really say anything very clearly. And I know, as I'll mention later, that it is tempting to just say Unitarian, because it's so easy, and it's so simple, and it's so explicable. But that's only half of our name. So this morning, we're going to talk about the other half. Now, I want to give you a 19th century definition of Universalism from about 1842, when it was the fifth largest denomination in the United States. Its theology was radical in one respect. It was evangelical, it was Christian, but it was radically liberal. Here's a quote from Aaron Nash, who was the editor of the Universalist Register in 1842. All Universalists believe in the existence of God, acknowledge Jesus as his Son, and of the Scriptures as divine revelation. Recognize limited rewards and punishments under the moral government of God and Jesus, and the final salvation of all intelligences from sin and suffering to a state of holiness and happiness. Now, that last phrase, that's the difference. That's the radical step. At that time, as I said, Universalism was the fifth largest denomination in this country. And what it did, unlike any other, was it had a robust challenge to Calvinism. And the notion that a pre-select would go to heaven and all the rest of us were going downhill fast. Everyone else was going to go to hell. This theology of universal salvation, because that's what it was, resonated with rural people, urban people, the uneducated, and the seekers. Its theology was very simple when you took it down to its bare bones. Neither the Hebrew Testament nor the teachings of Jesus spoke of hell for unbelievers and the strange promise of a loving God condemning most to hell and damnation. It was wrong. Now, that universalism and that quote from 170 years ago probably wouldn't translate too well today. Contemporary Unitarian Universalists may or may not believe in God. We may not believe in Jesus as God's Son, and certainly not the Bible as divine revelation. We'd have lots of argument about what was meant by the moral government of God and Jesus, and probably would ask or digress into, well, is any government moral? and then the conversation would really get wild. We could maybe agree with one phrase in that definition. The final salvation of all intelligences from sin and suffering to a state of holiness and happiness. Although the S words would get us a little quirky again. Sin and salvation. Now, last week, for those of you who were here, I talked about a whole different topic, but it was part one. I talked about how we as human beings, and maybe all sentient beings, have an evolutionary imperative to awakening. And for those of you with a Buddhist background, you know that's pretty much a norm. Those of you who were here will recall that I said that, in my humble opinion, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, the three monotheistic religions of the world, only got the word, or the idea of God, partly correct. I mentioned Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, who was a Jesuit priest, geologist, paleontologist, and thinker. He was roundly condemned by the Catholic Church of the day for his radical theory of an omega point. The omega point was, in his words, the evolution of all consciousness to an absolute place of awareness, of wholeness, of completeness. I took his theory another step to suggest that we, human beings and all sentient beings, are spiritually evolving through spiritual DNA to a collective awareness at the end of our evolution. In other words, what was mentioned in the reading is all shall be one. All will be whole at the end. That united awareness, I said, could be what we call God, but is really not the Christian, Jewish, or Islamic notion of a God who created us. It's the other way around. We create God instead, because it's the end of our evolution. Nothing superstitious, nothing miraculous, just evolution at work. As I said before, we would be the parents of God and not the children. We would have the responsibility to show the generations to come how to live wisely on earth, with one another, and most importantly, with ourselves. I then proposed at the end of those arguments that the idea of spiritual evolution is appealing because no one's left out. There's no one right religion that has all the answers. As I said in Amanda Fairbanks' memorial service last week, all it would take is one good deed in your life. Just one. And that good deed could be a thought, a word, or an action that we could call compassion. Such a good deed, just one, would open a doorway to what Universalists call universal salvation, or what we could call a return to wholeness at the end of evolution. Okay. So let's suppose we go back to that definition from 1842, and could we make it a little bit more contemporary for us? How could we translate his words into a new universalism that didn't require a particular faith or a belief in a creator God, and could include anyone who was on a spiritual path of compassion and wholeness? Here's my wording, and we're going to break it down into sections. Universalists believe in the evolution of God as loving consciousness. Acknowledge all who are compassionate as the forebears of God, and of all art and creative insight as revelation. Recognize the rewards and insights from our mistakes turned into wisdom. And in the final salvation of all intelligences, from brokenness and suffering to a state of holiness and happiness, with no one left out. So line by line, let me explain that redefinition of that 1842 wording of universalism. See if it's useful. Universalists believe in the evolution of God as loving consciousness. Well, I talked about this last week and a few minutes ago. God is our creation and not the other way around. We and all sentient beings will evolve into an ultimate awareness that is pulling itself to become itself and whole and complete. That's spiritual evolution. Acknowledge all who are compassionate as the forebears of God. Now, I use the word compassionate instead of love because I think love is a bit overused at times. We confuse the word love with romantic love or sexual love or specific types of love when it is such an embracing word that it's really hard to get a handle on. So here I'm using the word compassion and compassionate. The statement says that all who seek ways to become more compassionate for themselves and their world become the fathers and mothers of God. Because we pass down our best characteristics, our wisdom, our compassion, our love, our clarity, our teaching, to the generations after us. That's evolution. And of all art and creative insight as revelation. Instead of the word scripture with a big S, I'm suggesting it's all scripture. All art and creative insight that's translated into words, sounds, or sights, that's scripture. That's wisdom. That's revelation. Now you might say, well, wait a minute, what about hate literature or violent images on the internet? Those aren't very good ways, and you're right. But what they do is they tell us, I don't want to go in that direction. They tell us, I don't want to be like that. They tell us, I find that so crippling and unhealthy that I refuse to become what that is. What they do tell us, those pictures, or whether it's pornography or violence or any other thing that destroys human beings and other sentient beings, what those pictures of that art might show us is we just don't want to go there. That teaches us that we're better than that. But imagine, instead of one scripture that says it's right, imagine every book, every play, every movie, every song, Whitney Houston's music reminds me of it, that teaches us something about compassion, that reaches inside of us to tell us wisdom or the gift of being human. I'd say that's scripture, and no religion owns it. Could those not all be revelations to help us learn compassion and wisdom? It just as I said, means that no religion has a monopoly on truth. And as I said last spring about the Bishop Report, all truth is partial truth. And our task as human beings is to try to weave it together. The fourth part, recognize the rewards and insights from our mistakes turned into wisdom. This would, believe it or not, say that we make mistakes. But we also learn from our mistakes, and if we become more aware, awakened, and compassionate as a result, then it follows we are rewarded with insight and more wisdom, which we then hopefully transfer to others. And then finally, the final salvation of all intelligences from brokenness and suffering to a state of holiness and happiness with no one left out. Now, I thought it was pretty amazing that in 1842, this Universalist editor wrote of all intelligences. That was pretty impressive. It wasn't white Anglo-Saxon Protestants or New Englanders or human beings, but all intelligences. That was brilliant, because all intelligences in our day and time could mean every entity, every creature that could carry the possibility of intelligence and insight. And of course, we human beings believe that we're the only ones who are intelligent. But the likelihood is that our thinking's a little narrow. Salvation, let's translate it, we are saved into we are made whole. From brokenness and suffering to a place of holiness and happiness with no one left out. Well, that's pretty straightforward, I think. There's no rapture for Christians or Hindus or Unitarian Universalists. No one goes to heaven and all the rest of us left behind. It is universal salvation. Now, I'd say that universal salvation is simply this, if we get tweaky about the S word. I would propose to you that hell does exist, but it isn't after our lifetimes. It's not after we die. It comes with the territory of being alive. I heard it a few times last week at the UU Lunch and Learn event that we had, where we had new and veteran folks who talked about the religions they loved as children, or maybe they just got along with. And they loved them, or they put up with them, and as they became teenagers and young adults and maybe beyond, they began to see them as too confining, or they didn't answer their questions, or questions about doctrine weren't even acceptable, and going with the program was the only way to get to heaven. And somehow, over time, it just didn't work anymore. So what happened? For these people, and I suspect of more than a few in this room, the only way out was to become a religious seeker in a strange land. And you all came out on a journey, and you ended up here. But all the same, because you ended up here, doesn't mean that hell doesn't exist in this lifetime. Hell is being gay, lesbian, transgender, or bisexual in a culture that is deeply terrified of sexuality and believes it evil. Hell is being told that you're either us or them, and your answer will determine the rest of your life and in what community you can live, or if you're in community at all. Hell is addiction or loneliness or being 80 or 20 with no safe place to ask the questions about what is the meaning of life and what happens when I die. In the opening words today, Gordon McKeeman says it much better than I ever could. He says with that little pun, hell is a burning issue because it's the issue of separation. Whether we can set up little islands of isolation in the human experience and protect ourselves from the mainland. Does it feel safe? And Universalism says unequivocally, no, it cannot be done. Well, all right, so what? We're here on a cool, sunny Sunday morning in February 2012, and that quote is from a long time ago. What does this talk of universal salvation and hell have to do with us? We're educated. We don't believe any of that stuff. I disagree. I think you do believe in redemption and salvation, but in an entirely different way than our brothers and sisters congregations do around here. Just imagine how pleasurable or how less pleasurable it would be if you'd never found this fellowship. That you were still wandering out there in the wilderness, trying to figure out what your life was all about, what the meaning of life was, finding safe places to ask the tough questions, to be able to be around people who you love and who love you pretty much unconditionally and who are in the same search you are. Just imagine what it would be like if you hadn't found this place. Imagine all the people you know now who you'd never have met if you hadn't been on that spiritual journey. And yes, I know, I realize that there is a special joy in going out on the lake on a Sunday morning. I know that hiking or curling up with a good ebook is so powerful, and it's nurturing. But just think of the community you're missing. and all the great stories of the joys and sorrows and the insights that just maybe you'll carry away on Sunday morning. And though your life then has evolved because you've been blessed by another person's story. Imagine what you learn when you're moving outside your comfort zone, when you meet people who don't listen to NPR, or who are moderate Republicans, or who love Jesus with all their hearts. And you know what? They're here every Sunday with you. To me, a new universalism speaks equally to the first principle of the inherent worth and dignity of every person or every being, and to the seventh principle of the interconnected web, which leaves no one out. Each of us is on the evolutionary path to wholeness, and that is the web of all existence of which we are a part. So, let me finish by going back to our unsung heroes who are here today, Bernice and Albert. Imagine if those two, and we won't call them our forebears because that would be impolite, but imagine if they, as our sort of forebears, for many of us, if they'd not gone on that path to go outside the comfort zone of culture and do the work of justice. Just imagine if they hadn't done that. Imagine if they had been people to just sit over coffee or tea or nice meals and just complain. Because people do that too. They wouldn't like this, probably, although I don't know, Bernice might. I think they're missionaries. I think it's a good word. We're too scared of it sometimes. I think Bernice and Albert and so many other people are missionaries for justice and compassion in the world. And I would say you are too. You aren't content to stay home or go out on the lake or read an e-book on Sunday morning, but you're willing to come here and see, maybe I'm going to be inspired today. Maybe I'm going to learn how life can be made a little bit easier. Maybe I've come to a place of healing rather than hatred. And what Bernice and Albert did is they did like so many others do, and they founded this community that you're blessed to own today. Pretty incredible. Yes, I know you want to call yourselves Unitarian. It's nice and short. It's easy. But like it or not, you're all Universalists here, first and foremost, because it is your duty and your calling and your mission in this area, upstate South Carolina. When it's warm, when it's cold, when it's cloudy, when it's hot. It's your duty and your calling and your mission to bring people out of the hell realms of isolation and despair and feeling they have no place to call home in a religious community. If you do that, you're going to be on an undertaking that has spanned millennia to this day of people who are determined seekers and cheerful malcontents. Your mission, if you choose, as Unitarian Universalists, is to bring God to life. And bringing God to life means giving everyone out there who want them the tools they need to deepen their compassion for self, community, family, to hold true to the sure knowledge, and I'm saying the word faith, the sure knowledge that in the end, all will come to a state of holiness, wholeness, and happiness, with no one left out. And that, to me, makes me a believer in evolution of the body, the heart, and the mind into what we ultimately will become if we believe and if we are missionaries of the Spirit.